Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. Let's begin today's show on the Korean Peninsula, where tensions could turn from bad to worse. It's reported that DPRK has apparently threatened the U.S. with an unspecified so-called Christmas gift as denuclearization talks floundered. Christmas passed, but the peninsula is still on the edge. Before we get down to a discussion, take a look at this.
The risk of souring relations. China says recent tensions on the Korean Peninsula are due to the fact that an agreement between the U.S. and the DPRK at the Singapore summit fell short of being carried out and urged both sides to work out a feasible roadmap for peace.
Fresh tensions hit the Korean Peninsula, mainly due to the fact that the Singapore consensus was not carried out effectively, and the DPRK has not received enough attention and solution in its legitimate and justified concerns, with a window to peace shrinking due to the uncertainties and opportunities for dialogue are waning.
U.S. President Donald Trump has played down chances the DPRK is planning a long-range nuclear test. He says the U.S. is ready to deal with any surprises by Pyongyang.
Maybe it's a nice present. Maybe it's a present where he sends me a beautiful vase as opposed to a missile test. Right? I may get a vase. I may get a nice present from him. You don't know. You never know. We'll find out what the surprise is and we'll deal with it very successfully. And let's see what happens.
Denuclearization talks between the DPRK and the U.S. has lost momentum since the impasse at the Hanoi summit in late February and the unproductive working-level talks in Stockholm in October. With the coming U.S. presidential election in 2020 and geopolitics rearing its head in Northeast Asia, how to forge lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula is still a question.
Christmas gift or not between the DPRK and the United States? To give some their answers, we are joined in Washington, D.C. Soo Kim, a former CIA North Korea analyst and currently a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. In Los Angeles, we are joined by Jonathan Pollack, non-resident senior fellow of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings Institution. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Zhao Tong, a senior fellow of the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program and Merry Christmas to all of you. Did you receive some gift, Miss Kim, during Christmas?
Are we talking about the Christmas gift from North Korea or a personal gift?
I guess today we need to focus on the DPRK issue. So, what do you make of the nature of the so-called Christmas gift? After all, it was reported, not necessarily directly from the highest leadership of the DPRK.
Well, you know, they said a Christmas gift, but we also have to remember that even though Christmas passed, we still have to think about the year-end deadline. So from North Korea's optics, they probably wanted to give us repeated warnings through rhetoric and through these increased, escalated, missile tests. At this point, while we've sort of, bypassed Christmas without really seeing much from North Korea, there's still, opportunities for North Korea to ramp up escalation, to ramp up rhetoric. I think what Kim Jong-un is trying to do is to still maintain the pressure on the United States to have us keep guessing and to keep us on our toes. We see that the dynamics in the region are also, kind of in tenterhooks right now. So while we haven't seen much from North Korea, as we had expected, we can't be rest assured that we'll be scot-free right now from any potential further escalation.
I see. Mr. Pollack, agree with that? It's a reminder. Well, at the same time, there could also be huge danger if things are not resolved or discussed thoroughly at this stage, Mr. Pollack.
Well, I think that Kim Jong-un's promise of a gift doesn't specify what the gift is or even, frankly, when it may arrive. Right now, we're in the process of highly orchestrated moves by the North Korean leadership, including the party plenum that is to be held before the end of December, including Kim Jong-un's New Year's Day address and other activities highlighting that something is coming. It may be a political declaration of what is yet to come in the new year, but I think that Kim has generally adhered to these schedules and plans. It's a question of what he feels he needs to put down now as a marker, and whether or not it will include something overtly physical, a demonstration of military capability above and beyond what he has been doing in recent weeks and months.
Okay, some suggest, though, Mr. Zhao, that kind of Christmas gift that Mr. Polak just said may not necessarily be a smart choice, whether it is for Washington or it is for Pyongyang. After all, if it's a reminder, the degree of how to remind is extremely important, Mr. Zhao.
Yes, I think that's why many analysts actually believe that North Korea is going to start with a less provocative activity, such as a launch of a civilian rocket to send a satellite into the outer space. But there is no detectable sign that North Korea is preparing for such a civilian space launch at the Sohae launch site. So the next possibility, well, also a more moderate activity from North Korea would be a slightly longer range missile test. North Korea conducted a medium range missile test in October, so it can it can go further by launching an intermediate range ballistic missile. But we cannot rule out the possibility that North Korea go all the way to simply resuming ICBM, intercontinental range-based missile tests, and even with more powerful engines or different, more powerful models of ICBM missiles.
Well, but anyway, that metaphor, Christmas gift, whether it's coming from the DPRK or it's coming from the media report about the DPRK is another question. But certainly your president, Mr. Polak, loves that metaphor and talks about that and play with that in the tweets as well. What do you make of his recent reaction, if there is any coming also from the Pentagon, meanwhile, Mr. Polak, briefly?
Well, again, President Trump is hugely invested psychologically and otherwise in what he believes has been a fundamental breakthrough with North Korea. The evidence mounts that we are not anywhere remotely close to that the two sides are in very unbridgeable positions. So the question is whether or not whatever North Korea does choose to do in the coming days and weeks, whether that is within the spectrum of what Trump will tolerate, or does he revert, frankly, to where we were 2 years ago? That's the open question right now.
But Ms. Kim, if you think about it, there seems to be different reactions coming from different sides. After all, there was earlier six-party talks. You see many of the stakeholders here. Of course, key players, DPRK, the United States, but others also count. Chinese Foreign Minister, for example, earlier we played a quote of him during a year-end interview talking about DPRK nuclear issue. He said about two things. One is to establish peace, and the other is also to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, about establishing peace, didn't the U.S. also have a responsibility, or doesn't the U.S. also have a responsibility in this regard? After all, Singapore summit promised security guarantee. Where is it?
Well, so that's a really good question, because the security guarantee is also tied with the North Korean nuclear program. What the North Koreans are asking for is basically we get to keep our weapons, and in exchange for our quote-unquote good behavior, you're going to give us sanctions relief. The security guarantee, I believe, is North Korea's way of projecting that the U.S. military threat continues to pose a grave, I guess, detriment to North Korea's existence. And the United States has not really been hostile to North Korea. So for North Korea to insist upon it, I think, is to look at Kim Jong-un's long-term goal of getting the United States used to the North Korean nuclear weapons, its missiles, to a point where we accept it, and where we actually start to see the reduction of U.S. influence in the region, that's going to have, as you mentioned just now, that it's going to have implications not just between the U.S. and North Koreans, but the regional interests of China, of Japan, of South Korea.
Yeah. Really not hostile to Pyongyang from Washington since the Singapore summit? That's a question mark, isn't it, Mr. Zhao? I mean, you think about it. Over the past few days, defense bill outlining $4 million for a so-called human rights situation in DPRK. Of course, Pyongyang took it defensively, right? Secondly, you've also seen Washington trying to put pressure on Seoul over the past 2 years, suggesting Seoul should give more pressure to the DPRK. So is to China. Also put pressure on China, saying give more pressure to DPRK in response. And also you see the U.S. pushing at the UN General Assembly about some sanctions, further sanctions, not only from the United States, but also collectively from the UN to the North Koreans. So really not playing nice cards to Pyongyang, or we are seeing a combination of approaches, certainly not necessarily believed as beautiful, at least by Pyongyang.
Well, I think it's really hard for White House to strike a balance among several different domestic voices on how to deal with North Korea.
You're very empathetic, certainly, to Washington, but also I guess Pyongyang and Beijing and other capitals will cry for empathy as well.
Right. I mean, it's a delicate situation. I think it's a fact that the so-called human rights funds were basically included in a huge federal government spending bill. So it does not necessarily reflect the White House preference, and it's a Euro thing for the inclusion of.
So what you're saying is?
I think it reflects more of congressional preference over U.S. North Korean policy than what the White House wants to do.
But of course, when you are in Pyongyang, you wouldn't identify specifically, oh, this is coming from the Capitol Hill, and therefore I delivered this gift to White House instead of to the Capitol Hill. It is being collectively considered, I guess, as a U.S. approach, Mr. Zhao.
Right, but I think it's necessary for North Korea to appreciate the sophisticated situation in the United States.
They understand Washington quite well, if you look at the tactics.
So they wouldn't overreact by simply believing that President Trump has all the power to decide American-North Korea policy. There's a real risk that if North Korea overestimates or inaccurately calculates his bets in President Trump being willing to concede to North Korean pressure, there's a real chance that more military provocations could resume, and the U.S. could respond very harshly this time.
I see. But Mr. Pollack, at the same time, what's being said may not be as important as what is being done. So if you were in Pyongyang's shoes and you look at what Washington has been doing since Singapore, you might have a different feeling if you are in the shoes of Washington, right?
Well, let's just say, for sake of argument, that I'm in Pyongyang right now, which I'm not, or representing them, obviously.
No.
But I think to go back, even back to Singapore, you had an agreement that was, sketched out without any real negotiation, just some kind of a conversation over the course of a day. This is not the way to approach these kinds of issues, and rightly or wrongly, I think North Korea presumed that President Trump would accept them as a nuclear weapons state. And that was the basis for his calculations. They were shattered, of course, very much in the meeting in Hanoi. Things have been steadily downhill ever since. So on the one hand, Kim did very well for himself by being able to open doors to Washington, to Beijing, where he had never visited before, and to Seoul as well. So now you face a situation where others, including China, may have calculated that conditions had changed and that this process would be continued. But very frankly, this is exactly where in diplomacy, you can sketch things out, but it doesn't mean you've got an understanding of the core the core questions, the core issues. So this is what we confront right now. The question then becomes, what risks is North Korea prepared to take? What actions is President Trump prepared to tolerate? And very frankly, how do China and Russia respond in this context, since they seem much more invested than in the past to relations with North Korea?
What
so
you're saying,
we're approaching it yet again a
another
very
one.
delicate
Another
moment.
one, as you said, Mr. Pollack, you experienced
Yeah.
that moment many times, once and again in different circumstances. But that's exactly why we need to talk about so-called a feasible roadmap, which the Chinese Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang Yi, State Councilor, also mentioned in his interview. Is there a feasible roadmap? What could that be? Earlier experiences, could that be of some reference to what is going on now? Ms. Kim, you've been following this from very young age, I guess, on the issue of DPRK nuclear issue. So tell me, what exactly could be of reference today? Or is there any feasibility for a roadmap during an election year from Washington's politics?
So I think the roadmap should have been outlined back in Singapore. But as Dr. Pollack mentioned, it was just, based on a conversation. We walked away with 4 bullet points. I believe number 3 was the denuclearization, not of North Korea, but the Korean Peninsula. So not only was there like a gap in the understanding and definition of where denuclearization was going to be placed, it just left a lot of things to be open. And I think that's why we're seeing what we're seeing right now is the belligerence, the rhetoric, where the United States is trying to scale back and to basically to put the clamp back onto North Korea through these various measures with allies and by the NDAA. As far as going back to redrawing or redesigning a roadmap, I think that's what the United States is trying to do right now, is because we're in that, well, we're going through impeachment. We're also we're getting up ahead in election season. So there's a lot of things that President Trump needs to keep in mind, and North Korea is just one piece of the entire pie that he has to think about. So. Obviously, North Korea, we want this to be a priority for our national security interests and for the interests of our allies, but it might not take precedence right now where the president is so consumed with the impeachment, with chances of re-election, and also the trade dispute with China. So there's many things going on, and I think at best what we can do is to try to gain back whatever leverage we can through better enforcement of sanctions, to seeing how partners and countries in the region are going to respond and support this effort.
Sounds to me very interesting, Ms. Kim, what you just said. It sounds like, we are almost going back to the so-called strategic patience period of time, only with more enforcement of sanctions. So that's not necessarily a very good news, I have to say. Mr. Zhao here in Beijing, what do you think? A feasible roadmap, where is it?
Well, actually, in State Councilor Wang Yi's statement a few days ago, he referred to 2 roadmaps. One is a roadmap in terms of building a permanent peace regime over the Korean Peninsula, and I think China, in the recent draft resolution to the UN Security Council, mentioned it's necessary to resume 6-party talks. I think in order to build a permanent peace regime now, it's increasingly sensible to include other stakeholders to discuss how to build a peace regime, given the bilateral discussion is now stalled and North Korea doesn't have that much confidence in Americans' unilateral capability to implement its promise. So that's on the roadmap of building peace regime. The second roadmap is to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. On that issue, North Korea has been reluctant to directly negotiate with the United States. So I think it makes sense for Pyongyang to maybe discuss its plan of such a roadmap with Russia and China first. Maybe in that trilateral environment, North Korea will feel less afraid and be more open in saying its views and concerns.
We have seen some bilateral interactions not necessarily bearing much fruit, at least to say. Mr. Pollack, what do you think, that feasible roadmap?
I think we're in a situation where you have diplomatic definitions and statements of expectations that are so profoundly different between North Korea and the United States, and I might add, very, very different from what China is talking about in terms of its expectations of U.S. policy. Again, this goes back, I don't want to sort of revisit the Singapore summit, but the very fact that there was never, and even to this day, has never been any kind of an agreement between the North Korea and the United States on what denuclearization in fact was. Very different kinds of code language, you might want to say, diplomatic code language. So now we have a situation where North Korea clearly over the past 2 or more years has not turned down its activities to enhance its weapons capabilities, at the same time that the United States is insistent that it has to be a fundamental agreement and willingness of North Korea to forego all of its weapons capabilities. That's not the basis for a serious understanding between the two. So they're both engaged in a game of risk right now. Political risk, we hope it does not continue military risk as well, but this is a question that has eluded any kind of resolution for decades.
Okay.
And anyone who assumes this would be quickly resumed is really not paying attention.
We are not assuming anything, since the six-party talks decades ago already took place, and we know enough about the difficulties, as all of you know very well. Before we go, Mr. Zhao, I also want to point out, from China's perspective, how do you, with other guests from China, think about the fact, complicated issues here. China, Japan, and South Korea just recently had leaders meeting. This is rare. For a long time, over the past 20 years, this is the 8th time to think about why it is the 8th time only. Meanwhile, you also have China-U.S. reaching the so-called first phase agreement without yet being signing into papers between the two sides, and people are expecting the second phase could be even more difficult. Well, the bilateral relations, I wouldn't articulate more, you know better than I do, the nature of it now. So, and internationally, you also see very different crossroads at the moment. So, how should we understand this bigger picture with the DPRK, or should I say the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue? Mr. Zhao. Sorry to put you into such a complicated matter, but I guess all of these counts.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Interstate rivalry and hostility among regional countries is a major impediment for countries to join forces to resolve North Korean nuclear issue. But recently there is a new development. We see improved China, South Korea, Japan, and China-U.S. bilateral relationships. I think that's a very important and positive development. And domestically in the United States, there are senators recently wrote a letter to the president suggesting some very practical ways to break from this current impasse. They mentioned the phased approach, starting with temporary sanction removal in return for North Korea to put a substantial part of its nuclear program under dismantlement program. I think that's a feasible way forward. Hopefully the different forces in capitals can be combined into a collective effort to move things forward.
I see. Zhao Tong, Jonathan Polak, last but not least, So Kim. Thank you so much for joining us. Merry Christmas once again to all of you. Really appreciate it. We hope there will be peace, and we hope there will be denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Really appreciate it. Thank you.